Welcome back to the Augusta Sew-Along. In today's lesson, I'll discuss the specifics involved in cutting your alder. If you missed our previous lessons on pattern adjustments, you can find those in our YouTube profile under the Augusta Sew-Along series. I hope you all have your patterns ready because it's time to grab those scissors or a rotary cutter and get cutting. Before we get started with our fabric, let's talk briefly about how woven fabric is made. As you can see in this image, woven fabric is constructed by weaving horizontal weft yarns over and under a series of vertical warp fibers. This action is done on a loom. The horizontal weft yarns run along what we call the cross grain, and the vertical warp yarns form the straight grain. At either edge, running along the length of the fabric, is the selve edge. This is a tightly woven edge finish created during manufacturing, and this is what you'll align your pattern's grain line with. Now we'll discuss pre-treating and prepping your fabric. You'll want to pre-wash and dry your fabric prior to cutting to reduce or eliminate shrinkage in your final garment. Make sure you wash your yardage using the same method and settings that you're planning to use to wash your finished garment. So say you want to wash your finished Augusta on cold, you'd wash your yardage on cold. If you're going to wash the finished Augusta on warm, wash the fabric on warm. Same thing goes for drying. The last thing you want is your garment shrinking after you've finished it and you spent so much time perfecting that fit. Once out of the dryer, you want to give your fabric a good press. Cutting is always easier on a nice flat fabric, so don't skimp on this step. If you're working with a particularly wrinkly fabric, like linen, taking the fabric out of the dryer just before it's completely bone dry and pressing it then can help get the wrinkles out a bit better. The next step in cutting your pieces is laying out the fabric. Laying out your fabric is pretty straightforward. First off, you're going to need to determine the right and wrong side of your fabric. If you're using a printed fabric, this is easy. The printed side is the right side. Solid fabrics and fabrics with woven designs can be a bit harder. There are too many types of woven fabrics to cover them all here, but if you can't tell which is the right or wrong side, there are a few clues that might help. The first tip I have is to check the selve edge. This fabric is printed, but say it wasn't. A lot of times there's writing on the selve edge, and this is usually the right side. If the selve edge has holes, the raised side would most likely be the right side due to the way fabric is finished, though there are exceptions to this rule. If it's a woven design, there may be floats on the wrong side of the fabric. So here is a woven cotton. You can see floats on one side and the other side is smooth. So the smooth side is the right side and the side with the floats is the wrong side. If you still can't tell which is the right or wrong side, then all you have to do is pick the side you like best. When doing this, make sure that you mark one side of all your pattern pieces as either the right or wrong side to avoid confusion during the sewing process. For example, you can place a chalk mark, a piece of tape, or a safety pin on the right side of each piece to make sure the final garment has the right side facing out consistently. You'll now lay out your fabric with the selve edges together. A lot of people have you fold the right sides of the fabric together, but I prefer to fold mine with the wrong sides together. That way, if I'm working with a stripe or print, which I am here, I find it easier to choose which parts of the print I want where when the pattern is facing out. Often, it's harder to see the print on the wrong side of the fabric due to the printing techniques used, and that's the case here. This means you can potentially struggle more with print and pattern matching. Once your selve edges are aligned, check to make sure there's no torquing at the folded edge. Here you can see these wrinkles that are being created. It's because the selve edge is not properly aligned. So all you have to do is just slightly shift. And there we have a smooth selve edge. And I like to do this little kind of fingernail scrape. It just helps to move one layer of the fabric and evens out wrinkles nicely. Now that our fabric is properly laid out, it's time to place our pattern pieces. To lay out your fabric, start by locating the cutting diagrams in your instruction booklet. Each set of patterns has a complete set of cutting diagrams, which are based on the size that you're cutting and the width of your fabric. Please note that the front of the shirt and dress are not cut on the fold. This is due to the asymmetrical neckline, and these pieces are cut flat through one layer of fabric only. Now, one thing to keep in mind with these layouts is that we have not laid them out for directional fabric. We've laid them out for the best fabric yield. Directional fabric is a fabric with a clear top and bottom to the print or design, such as flowers with a stem, people, etc. When cutting directional fabric, you'll want to make sure that the tops of each pattern piece align with the top of the print. For the Augusta, our diagram for non-directional fabric has the pattern pieces laid out like so. And keep in mind, the fabric that I'm using is actually narrower than 45 inches wide, so the layout is not exactly what's in the booklet. Now you can see here that the top of the back and the top of the yoke are facing one way, and the short sleeve is facing the other, as is the right lapel. If this were a directional fabric and the bottom of our print was to our right and the top of our print was to our left, these pattern pieces would be laid out properly, and we'd want to flip these two so that everything is facing the right way with the print. Just keep this in mind if you're working with a directional print. We are not here, so we are going to put our pieces back the way they were. I weight my pattern pieces with professional cloth weights, but you can use anything. Cloth weights, which are also known as pattern weights, are made from cast iron and weigh about 4 pounds each. They're made to weight a pattern to cloth while tracing and cutting, and are low profile so you can easily maneuver around them. You can find these at any pattern making supply store. Small cloth weights for home sewing are available at most sewing supply stores, or you can use heavy washers, cans of food, anything heavy with a relatively low profile works great. Another option for keeping your patterns in place is pinning it to the fabric. I personally avoid this method as if you're working with a non-tissue pattern like we are here, it raises the fabric in the area of the pins and can sometimes create a jag while you're cutting. I find it can also be hard to cut around the pattern piece while it's attached to the fabric. Now, to align your pattern pieces, you're going to pay attention to what's written on the pattern. So this says place on fold, grain line. The arrows mean this butts up against the fold. So we'll weight that down. Now for pieces that are not cut on the fold, like the lapel, you'll lay your piece out and then measure from the grain line over to the selvage edge. So here we have 3.5 inches. And then measure the other end and 3.5 inches. So now it is on grain and you can weight it down. Continue doing this until all your pattern pieces have been laid out. We'll talk about the front not on the fold in a moment, but for now, let's just lay out the pieces that are on the fold. I prefer to trace around my pattern pieces, remove the pattern, and then cut, rather than cut around the paper on the fabric. To trace, I use either a marking tool with a chalk wheel, a fine point mechanical chalk pencil, or a plain old number 2 pencil, which is what I'll be using today. When cutting, you want to cut off the lines you've marked so you can use anything that doesn't bleed with no trouble. So to trace, simply follow along the edge of the pattern piece. Here you can see my traced edge. And we'll just work all the way around and make sure you transfer your notches. There are a lot of match points on this pattern. We'll talk about those in a moment. All right, these two pieces are now traced around the edge, and it's time to mark our match points. There are a few ways you can mark these match points. The first is simply with a pin. This is easy and it leaves no mark when removed, but it can fall out as you work. So you can just stick a pin through the match point. And there it is. The second method is to use chalk or a marking pen. You'll want to make sure that the marking tool you use really does come out if you're going to use this method, because you don't want these showing. The third method is to use a tailor's tack, and I'll show you how to do this in this area without a pattern because it's hard to see with the fabric. Simply insert the needle into the fabric and bring it back up, pull it through, leaving a thread tail. Hold the tail down, and then you'll come right back down and up in the same spot as the first time. Pull that, and then cut. You can easily remove this later and it's not going to go anywhere. So one thing to keep in mind is that since we're cutting with the fabric folded, we're going to have two pieces. So at this stage, you're only going to be able to mark the match points on the top layer, and you'll need to transfer that over to the bottom layer when you're done. So what I do to mark my pieces is sort of a hybrid of the pin and tailor's tack. I go through while I'm laying things out and I just shove a pin through really quick. That way it's marked. I don't need to worry about it while I'm cutting. I don't have to make thread tacks right now, but everything is marked. Then remove the pattern piece and I put the pins through so they don't come out while I'm cutting. So once I've removed the pattern, I'll cut this out like normal. And then when I separate the pieces, I'll still be able to see the hole where the pin went in, and I can use that marking to put my tailor's tacks in. So once everything is marked, you can remove your pattern piece, and then we'll cut. To cut, you can use either a scissor or a rotary cutter, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I'll be using scissors because that's what I like and I find comfortable, but there's no wrong way. Whatever you like to do is what you should do. Now, cutting is pretty straightforward. You're going to cut around your pattern pieces, cutting off your marking. And when you get to your notches, make sure you clip them. Now, when you clip your notch, make sure not to clip further than half of the seam allowance deep. So in the case of the Augusta, we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so your notch clips will be cut 1/4 inch into the pattern piece. And that's how they're marked on the pattern as well. So just continue cutting. Clip your notch, and then continue for the rest of your pattern pieces. Now to cut the front, everything is the same except we're only cutting through one layer of fabric. So lay your front out. Again, we're going to measure over to the selve edge, 13 3/4. Weight down our pattern, and then we'll trace it off. Again, make sure you mark your notches. Now that our pattern is traced, we need to mark our match points. So I'm just going to do this with a pin, and we can put in tailor's tacks later if we want. And don't forget to mark all of these front match points. They will be necessary. 2 dart points and 2 side seam match points. 1 and 2. Can now remove your pattern piece and cut as you normally would. One of the nice things about tracing is that if you can't reach an area, your hand won't bend, your table's in the way, you can just kind of cut around the pieces like I've done here. Remove the fabric and then rotate your piece so you can have easier access to cutting. And that doesn't work as well when you have 2 layers of fabric, but it is still possible. But it's really nice if you're cutting flat. And cut out the neckline. And there's your front. Now that our fabric is cut, we need to cut out our interfacing. If you're unsure what interfacing is, it's a layer of fabric used on the inside of a garment to reinforce or add rigidity to the area of application. On the Augusta, the interfacing is used in the collar to help give it shape and help maintain the crispness of the edges. We talked about interfacing in the first video of this series, but again, for the Augusta, you're going to want to use a lightweight woven fusible interfacing. You want the drape of the interfacing to have a similar weight to your fabric. That way, you aren't affecting the way the final garment hangs or acts. Cutting your interfacing is very similar to cutting your fabric. In the case of woven and tricot interfacing, there is a grain line and you want to make sure you adhere to it, so that way it isn't fighting the grain of your fabric. Some interfacing doesn't really have a clear selve edge like fabric, so if yours doesn't, you're going to use the non-cut edge as your selve edge. This one here does, so we know that this is our selve edge. Now there are 3 pieces that you'll need to cut out of interfacing for the Augusta. We have the left lapel, the right lapel, and the upper collar. You'll notice on the marking for the left and right lapel, it says interfacing, cut 1, glue side up. That means you're going to cut it out with the glue of the interfacing. That's the bumpy rough side, facing up, like this. So here I have the glue side facing up and the pattern on top of it. Now again, since there is a grain line, we're going to want to double check that we are adhering to it. So here we have 4 1/4. And not even close. 4 1/4. Now I do use a rotary cutter for my fusible interfacing, a tiny one, and you can just trace around it. Make sure you try not to cut off any of the pattern, because if you do that enough times repeatedly, it will affect the finished size of your pattern piece. And if you want to make this again and again, like I do, you'll eventually have a pattern that's not quite the right size. And the 2 lapel pieces are not cut on the fold, so you're only cutting 1 of each. Now you don't need to mark the match points because we've already done that on the fabric, but I do like to clip my notches, and I don't do that with a rotary cutter. It's hard to get the rotary cutter in there without slicing too far. So here we have our right lapel, and we're just going to repeat that for the left. Then we'll talk about the upper collar. Now the upper collar is cut on the fold. So just like our fabric, we're going to align the edge of the center back on the fold, weight it down, and then cut it out. And since this piece is symmetrical, you can cut it with the glue side out or the glue side in, doesn't matter. Make sure you've cut through everything. Again, I like to mark those 2 notches. And there you have your upper collar. All right, that's it for today's lesson and for the prep work. Next up, we will be sewing and assembling our collar. I'll walk you through fusing your collar pieces, sewing up both lapels, and attaching them to your Augusta. I'll see you back here for that next week, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any of our video updates. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you back here next time ready to sew. Bye!